And I think when Paul realized, hey, I'm not the only outsider. There's this community that was also not part of the Jerusalem church that got expelled or something. And that gave him a little chutzpah.
The Apostle Paul, today on In the Shadow of the Cross. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of In the Shadow of the Cross. Thanks for joining us. I'm here once again with my friends Jim Durkin.
Hello.
And Michael Harden.
Hello.
Hello. And today we have another interesting topic for you. We thought it would be cool to talk about the Apostle Paul. Talk about a very popular person to look at. Christians use his letters all the time, especially in sermons and writings. And he's a highly discussed individual. But it's also interesting how I found that everybody likes to make Paul be their guy. I've seen people go as far as to say Paul was, pro-law, or I've watched people say he was misogynistic. I've seen people kind of make Paul fit whatever image that they want him to fit. And we thought it would be interesting here to actually talk about Paul from a standpoint of who was this guy, and from his writings, what do we know about him? Did he always believe the same way? Was he in the exact same mindset as all the other apostles? Were there things about Paul that maybe we didn't grow up, if you're like me, not so aware of? So we're going to do that. We're going to look at this interesting guy, Paul. So guys, what do we know about Paul? Who is this guy?
Well, before we talk about Paul, what we need to talk about is the early church in the 2nd century saw the need for apostolic succession. And so they began collecting their literature and their traditions from those that were apostles, Paul included. Okay, Peter. Mark is connected to Peter in the tradition. The Johannine authors connected with John, the son of Zebedee, in the tradition. Matthew with Matthew, the scribe, in the tradition. And Luke, the companion of Paul. So you have apostolicity in this. But as the church is in battling with Gnosticism for the next 300 years, and it moves towards a theological orthodoxy in the doctrine of the Trinity, it also brings with it this concept that the early church was united, was one, and there's one apostolic teaching, and then we just begin to move on through the ages. Now, this notion of one doctrine, one apostolic doctrine, right, in the post-Reformation period was shattered because of the Reformation. And in around the beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s, there was a New Testament scholar, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who was looking at the Pauline literature and saw that there was a real break. There were real issues between Paul and the Jerusalem church. And so Bauer developed this thesis that the early church wasn't one. It wasn't always united. It didn't start in unity. You know what I mean? And so that thesis has been revised, killed off, revived again in different forms for the last several hundred years. I think the most recent and interesting forms is that of Michael Goulder in his work on this particular topic. But if we are willing to take Paul at his word in Galatians, he has people from the Jerusalem church coming into his congregation saying that what he's been teaching them is wrong.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is from his own mouth.
Right.
Okay. So as we're discussing Paul, we're going to want to just keep that in mind. Number 2, We want to use Paul's letters, not Acts, because Acts is written half a century later than Paul's death. Acts is not a history as such. It's a wonderful, delightful narrative. It's full of insight into the early church, but it is not a history as such.
Can we camp there just a second? Because what you just said probably just blew a lot of people's minds and kind of rocked their world a little bit. So can you expand on that?
Well, it would, there would be so much here, Loren, to do. We would have to talk about Luke's use of sources, the kinds of sources he's using, when the book is written, why it's being written. Why do I follow, for example, Joseph Tyson and date it into the late teens of the second century? So there would be much to unpack there. Nevertheless, Acts there's written sources behind it. Okay. There's the first 13 chapters. Luke pretty much has to make up chapters 14 and 15. And then he gets to the travelogue. And then he's in and out of the travelogue on the journey. It depends on when the person that's writing the we sections of Acts is with Paul or not. Because if he's not, then it says, and they, and they, and they. But when this character rejoins the narrative, it's and we, and we, and we, So many things to discuss. What's important here is that we're going to use primary material. We're going to use Paul's letters.
Okay.
We're not going to try to fit Paul into Luke's portrait of Paul.
Okay? Oh, I follow what you're saying. Okay. So it's Paul. Like Luke's the biographer who's
we're going to let Paul be Paul.
Yeah, good.
Right?
Okay.
And we're going to, in the process of all of this, if we get to it, we'll actually uncover a bit of editorial fatigue by Luke on a very, very important topic related to Paul and the Jerusalem community and the letter they sent out. And I think I may have mentioned this before. When Paul comes back to Jerusalem in Acts 21, I believe, whenever it is, they take him aside and they say, hey, nice to see you. We wrote a letter. We need to tell you about this letter we sent out. As though Luke didn't have Paul already there at the letter writing in Acts 15. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we can get into that. But it's really key if we're going to start with this thesis. We have to ask, what was the battle over? And we're given one story, and that's the incident at Antioch. So what was the battle over at Antioch?
Yes, that was going to be my question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, wasn't it circumcision and the Gentiles?
No.
Okay.
No, this is a community that is the first Gentile welcoming community.
Oh, it was, could they eat with the Gentiles?
Could they eat together?
Yes. And that was a huge deal.
The Antiochenes had already figured out they could. Okay.
Okay.
They were actually eating with the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They'd seen this bigger eschatological vision. Okay.
Yeah.
And the leadership in Jerusalem gets word of this and sends figures up north to shut this thing down. Now.
Okay. Pause real quick because I just want to highlight what you just said. This needs a sports highlight reel there. I mean, a replay. Because you just said they got word that they're eating together.
Yeah.
And they sent people because
like
that's not a good thing.
That's right. You have Jewish Christians eating with Gentile Christians, not Jews eating with Gentiles. Jewish Christians eating with Gentile Christians. Okay. Jews come up from the south. They come in, they're going to shut this thing down right there. And the Apostle Paul stands up and he says, you hypocrites, you and your bad theology, right? And the stir is so great here over this issue that Paul loses.
Wow.
Everybody goes along with the James crowd. Who knows what James said? Hey, I was with Jesus Christ Superstar. It was my big brother. I mean, whatever it was. whatever that authority was that the James Petrine Jerusalem church tradition had, at that point, broke the Church of Antioch into two parts, Jewish Christian and Gentile Christian. Now, in Paul's mind, we know how Paul thinks in 2 Corinthians. The Antioch incident is sometime between 48 and 50, depends where you want to situate it. I situate it in late 48 for comfort, because I can account for it in the chronology at that point, Big incident, bam, Paul loses that battle. Barnabas, John Mark, everybody else, where do they go? And here's Paul left standing all alone going, you know what? We were doing God's will, and now you've turned us off to that.
Wow.
Okay? What was the issue? For the Jews, the Jewish Christians, the James community, the issue was keeping the basic minimum standard of Jewishness.
Okay.
Which included three things: kosher, circumcision, and Sabbath. But in this case, only kosher's being dealt with. Okay? By the time we get to Galatia, now they've added circumcision.
Right.
By the time the Gnostics get a hold of it in Colossae, they've added Sabbaths.
Oh.
Okay?
Very interesting.
So these three parts, kosher, the minimum requirements, right? Okay, now, remember when we go back to the book of Acts, they send a letter with 4 minimum requirements.
Yes.
Remember that, right? They're different, but they're related to the Noahide covenant. But still, you have to have a little bit of Jewish in you in order to be Christian. Okay?
Right.
Okay. Now, when they break the church in two, you no longer have one body of Christ.
Wow.
You no longer have the celebrated reconciliation of Jew and Gentile at feast.
Yeah.
You've just lost your eschatological vision. You've lost your sociological formation. You've lost it all. And for Paul, everything was at stake at Antioch. Everything was at stake. And he lost. This is really important.
Yeah.
Because for the rest of his career, those emissaries from Jerusalem are going to be hounding his mission field. He says himself, I won't go into anybody else's mission field. Okay? But they're coming into his to correct him. We know Peter came to Corinth. What in the world is Peter doing in Corinth? And isn't it interesting, after Peter gets to Corinth, we have problems.
Wow.
Right? We know these emissaries from James come to the Galatian churches and create problems. They don't get to Philippi, but Paul, the Philippians and Paul are very, very intimate, and they know about these rascally devils, right? And in Romans, he's writing a letter to a church he's never been to, that he knows has heard of this other mission. This James Peter mission. And Romans is his way of saying, I'm going to get my letter there before they get there and indoctrinate you. And so it's like a prophylactic in that sense. Get my letter there. And it's an ambassadorial letter, as Robert Jewett observed in his great work. It functions as Paul himself. It's an ambassadorial letter. It's really quite remarkable. And it is very clear that the diatribe in the first 4 chapters is set up over exactly the same types of issues that are being dealt with in the other letters in and around the keeping of the Torah. Is it a requirement that Gentiles keep any part of the Torah?
Wow. Well, first I have to say, I see why they call you the dude of theology, because when I hear you talk, I go, dude. the Californian in me, that's all I can say.
Really?
That is massive. We have to pause and acknowledge that a lot of people just had the worlds blown up. Because if they're like me, they were raised with the mentality that the early church, everything was in perfect harmony, in unity. All the apostles were walking in lockstep with each other. And there was just this great agreement, other than a few, minor disagreements here and there or something. And
The occasional heretic.
Exactly right. And here, it just blows up that view and goes all the way from the beginning. We as followers of Christ were having issues, and it also shows that I guess part of it is some of the people aren't as squeaky clean as we thought they were, if you'd put it that way. And then it also really opens up Paul's writings now on the frustration you almost feel, especially in Galatians, is what immediately comes to my mind. Mm-hmm. Because the way I was taught with it is it's just a letter about law versus grace, and when you read that, it's like, oh, that's not even the tip of the iceberg. There, there's huge stuff going on.
What's really wonderful in the Protestant tradition is Protestants. We are filled with grace. We don't follow the law, and yet everything's about the rules of the damn church.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or obeying the law,
Yeah. And then when you were talking about Romans too, my mind immediately went to in Romans chapter 1. Because you're talking about how this is Paul writing to a church he's never been to, and just how horribly that first chapter has been abused and completely missed the point. That what's really tragic is that when Paul writes that, because is you would know more about this than I do, but basically. When Paul writes, he does the same thing in Galatians, where he gives the voice of his opponent, and then he rebuttals that point with his answer.
It's not so much in Galatians that he does it. He gives the viewpoint of his interlocutor, but it's actually only here in Romans that as Doug Campbell famously explored and for Campbell, it's not going to stake his life on it or anything, but it certainly looks as though what Paul is doing in Romans 1 through 4 is a very formal, rhetorical expose that would have been very familiar to the lettered people, the educated, the house church leaders that this letter is being written to. And the important thing here is that Paul sends someone when he sends his letters. He always sends them with someone. He doesn't put them in the general post.
Right.
And the Romans had a general post.
Yeah.
They did. It was a good postal system for the ancient world. But Paul always sends the letter with someone. Why? If there's any number of reasons, but one, that person knows Paul's mind. They know how to interpret Paul. So if someone says, I don't understand that, they can explain it. But number two, in a letter like Romans, where you have the intentional use of the setting up of an opponent's argument, and you want to do it rhetorically as though it was their little sermon that you're going to rebut, chapter 118 to 32 is that Jewish Christian, Gentiles are bad, they don't have the Torah, they're worthless, they do all kinds of deviated sexual things, they don't know anything, wrath of God's come upon them, apocalyptic, Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic stuff, right?
Yeah.
Now, that viewpoint right there is standard Jewish trope, which means you go to the book Wisdom of Solomon, and you're going to find most of what's there in Romans 1, 18 to 32, somewhere in the latter half of the book Wisdom of Solomon, sometimes chunked together. It's rather amazing.
I saw that. Because I'd heard you mention that, and so I picked up a Bible that had the Apocrypha in it, and it was astonishing to see that. Yeah. And I have to admit, I felt kind of betrayed. In the sense of that my whole life I'd been taught this particular way about Romans 1, and nobody ever said, oh yeah, it's thought for thought of what's over here in this other book, that Paul is referencing a point of view that was familiar to the Jewish people,
Right.
not his own point of view.
Right.
And so what's really tragic, and I really hope people listening get a hold of this, is that people who turn that into Paul's stance on the letter and go to war over this, that passage, what they don't understand is they're actually siding with the opponent, the exact point of view that Paul was opposing. So you're actually standing toe to toe directly opposite of Paul because of your bad interpretation. And if you need to know the term, look up the term for those listening. It's called prosopopoia.
Prosopopoia.
And it's a Greek literary device to argue a point, much like our politicians when they debate or something, that you would present the opponent's argument, and then you would present your point of view, your counter, your rebuttal to that. And that the entire book of Romans, well, not the entire book, but a big chunk of it is written that way. And
this first chunk in chapter 1, Paul's going to rebut in chapters 2, 3, and 4. See, he starts off by saying, I am not ashamed of the gospel, which he's later going to call my gospel. Okay?
Yeah.
Right.
For it is the power of God to save to everyone who trusts, right? For God is rectified. The righteousness of God, the rectification of God is revealed through trust. As it is written, he who trusts is righteous and shall live. Trust is the key.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, Paul doesn't come back to his gospel until chapter 5.
Yeah.
He first has to show that, okay, if you want to start off with this Gentiles as nasty sluggards, let's look at you, my Jewish friends. And then, as Campbell observes, he's actually citing certain events that took place, a very famous theft. A Jewish merchant was caught as a thief. And so in 2:14 or so, where Paul says, do not some of you steal? He's referring to these incidents, right?
Interesting. See, hold on. I want to pause again because this kind of stuff fascinates me. Because we so often, when we read these things, we're reading the past, that we don't realize that for them, this is contemporary writing.
This is contemporary, that's correct.
So Paul is referencing something just as the same as if I reference something maybe about Joe Biden or something,
Right, exactly. So the argument for Paul in chapter 2 and 3 is that we're all condemned. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. End of story. And the wages of sin is death. And by the time Paul is done slicing and dicing the interlocutor, God hates everybody, as Mark Driscoll puts it. Right? But he's merciful, and so we're going to turn the tide there at the end of chapter 3, and we're going to talk about mercy and how big and expansive mercy is. And after he uses Abraham to justify his epistemology of trust, okay, chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8 is Paul's theology. That's Paul's theology.
5, 6, 7, and 8.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now he has to go back and battle the interlocutor and the concept that the Jews are the chosen people. They're the ones that have the salvation. Paul has to go, nope, this thing has been blown wide open. You have to have a bigger view of history. And so in chapters 9, 10, and 11, particularly 9 and 10, okay, particularly 9 and 10, you're going to get a lot of the interlocutor again, right? And the Calvinists come in and go, oh, good, we'll make a doctrine of election here. No.
So again, you're taking the voice of the opponent to be Paul's mind.
Right. And so in chapter 11, as Paul brings the grafting of the trees together, he says, I'm going to tell you again what I said in chapter 3. But I know we don't have chapters in Paul's letters, but I'm going to tell you again what I said in chapter 3. All have sinned. All have sinned. All God has put all under disobedience. Why? In order that he might have mercy on them all. And now we've hearkened back to Romans chapter 5 and the Adam-Christ parallelism. right? As in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive. Man, right? Boom, boom, boom. And then chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15 are the Didache, Paul's Didache, right?
Okay.
And the way it relates to what? In chapter 14, to what? Food, kosher, the issue of kosher
Yes.
eating. Is there one Eucharist or are there two Eucharists? One body of Christ or two body of Christs? Paul's vision in all of his letters is one body of Christ. But we are baptized into one body. Ephesians chapter 4, right? Right? Well, one body, not two. That's
Yeah.
visible, and you can't separate them. Unfortunately, within a decade of Paul's writing his letters, history would force the split, and Jerusalem would come under siege and war for 4 years, and eventually the Jewish Christianity went off into the east and down into Africa, and Pauline Christianity and Johannine Christianity developed in and around the Mediterranean, and then up into Europe in particular, or what I would call, quote, early, quote, apostolic, unquote Christianity.
Okay.
And so Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity are severed by history.
Right. And the thing I find interesting about what you're talking about with Romans is that sometimes we don't really understand it. It's almost like when Paul was writing it, the way we would have a view. It's almost like Paul's just this theologian just sitting there theologizing, just writing these big books and, writing these letters. But what I love that you really bring that down is that, no, Paul is addressing a very prevalent issue. And there is a clear point to what he's driving at. Like you said, the issue of food, the issue of division, the Gentile Jewish division there. It's like, this is a serious issue that he's facing.
Yeah, it's the same. So we have the same fundamental structural setup here in America today. Can straight people have communion with gay people?
Exactly.
See?
Exactly.
And of course, the fundamentalist side of the tradition will bring in the law and try to say, nope, don't do that. Can't have, we've got denominations literally, they have not split for anything for hundreds of years, and they are splitting now over this issue of growing acceptance within modern Christendom of the LGBTQ plus communities.
Right. And the irony is the chapter that's used, the New Testament passage that's used to hold the position is the exact argument Paul was saying, Jews, this is what you think of Gentiles. And the modern Christians are going, this is what we think of gays. And it's like, so you're exactly doing what the Jews did, splitting the church over saying that there are those who when if you take the book of Acts, what the Lord has cleansed, let no one call unclean. You're still saying there are those who are unclean.
I'd like to go back to something you said earlier. I've been kind of camping on that for a while. You were talking about the split, if you will. You mentioned that Barnabas and I believe John Mark pulled away from Paul.
Right.
And I believe you said that it was over this very issue of eating with Gentiles.
Correct.
I thought the argument was over John Mark. Can you explain that?
Okay, so let's just jump into. You don't know the chapter that Paul and Barnabas separate. Here we go. Okay, so So Acts 15 tells the story of this apostolic council. Right? And, of course, it has to validate Peter. First of all, Peter gets credit for going to the Gentiles.
Correct. And
that whole Cornelius story in the book of Acts, right? Which may be historical, but it's certainly not a mission to the Gentiles, nor is Peter given that mission.
Yeah.
In verse 19, 20, and 21, James, after giving a sermon, gives the 4 things that the Gentiles should abstain from: idols, unchastity, from what is strangled, and blood. Those four things.
Right.
Now, idols, what is strangled, and blood all have to do with food.
Correct.
Okay? It seems good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them and send them to Antioch.
Okay.
Okay? With Paul and Barnabas.
Mm-hmm.
So the assumption is Paul's there. But again, as I said later, the writer has editorial fatigue and doesn't forgets that Paul was here and acts as though he wasn't. And Paul never says he was here at this kind of an event. If this is even an historical event, like I said, it falls outside of the purview of the early church source that Martin Hengel talks about, or the travel log, the travel diary that Pauline scholars refer to. So they send this letter, and then they go to Antioch. They deliver the letter. Everybody rejoices at their expectations. Paul and Barnabas remain in Antioch. And after some days, Paul says, let's go return and visit the brethren in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. And Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. Paul thought it best not to take one who had withdrawn from them previously. Paul is, if there is a real historical Antioch event underlying this made-up Jerusalem council narrative, if it's occurring at this point in Paul's historical life, he is hurt. He has been betrayed. And so all I'm trying to say is there's a connection between Paul's description of Antioch in chapter 2 of Galatians and the betrayal of the Jerusalem community. And in the book of Acts, you have apostolic council and then the dealing with betrayal. Okay? So narratively, they both belong together.
Okay.
That's all I would point out there.
So there's another place I'm not sure of the chapter and verse, but where Paul says that, at one point he says, I have none with me except Timothy.
That would be a 2 Timothy. And
okay.
As you know, Jim, I don't think that the pastoral letters, 1st and 2 Timothy and Titus, were written by Paul.
I understand.
I think they're written around 120 to reclaim Paul's heritage away from the Marcionite tradition. And so is the book of Acts.
Does that take away from that statement, though?
No, but the question is it historical?
Okay.
So you could say that the Paul of the letters felt abandoned, and we know that Paul experienced that kind of stuff in his own life because we've experienced it as well.
Sure.
Right?
And would it have been over this issue? Over the issue of eating with Gentiles?
Are you referring to the 2 Timothy reference?
Well, this feeling of being abandoned, of not knowing who he has with him. Yeah.
So I think what we have to deal with, and maybe we can do that next week, is we have to talk about how Paul's theology changed. Because imagine Paul goes out and he's had his own private time. He took 3 years off, man, to kind of like going to go to the psychiatric facility down near Lebanon and get my head together and come back and go to Arabia for vacation and coming back. And we're going to talk to James and Peter for a couple of weeks and get to know the Jesus tradition a little bit, right? Who was Jesus? What was he like? Whenever I met Bonhoeffer's students and friends, I asked all those kinds of crazy personal questions. What was he like? What was it like to be with him? What did he like to talk about? What did you like? What did you do to him? He loved to play, by the way. Loved to take hikes and play ball, and he's very athletic. So his theology changes, but we should build to that point this week, because what if in fact it were possible to propose a thesis, and that's what it is. Okay, we're not claiming revelation or inspiration or anything here. It's a thesis. It's a way to read the literature. What if we were able to show that the Apostle Paul when he was first developing his Christian thinking, that he was doing it within the same theological framework as the Jerusalem church. And when he goes out on his first mission, he is carrying that gospel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, what if then we're able to show that that has been inscribed in 2 letters? And furthermore, what if we're able to show that the other 8 authentic Pauline letters, I'm not counting the pastorals, the other 8 authentic Pauline letters, were written in a flurry between the years 50 and 52. And we sat those letters side by side with those first 2 letters that were written in 41. And we notice all the differences, and we can trace all of them back to one thing. And if you're an evangelical, you want to be here next week, because 2 things are going to happen. One is you're going to change your underwear midstream. And number two, you are going to be liberated and freed.
I think that's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to that. Not changing my underwear, but being liberated and freed.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I'm really fascinated with just what we're talking about right here, and I guess I'm fascinated with it for a couple of reasons, and it has to do with what you and Loren were talking about right at the end of your discourse back and forth, and that's that the church right now is facing something that it has the same type of weight to it as what you're describing, the division that came over eating with Gentiles, and that's how the church treats or even allows themselves or disassociates themselves from the LGBT plus community. And it isn't even the community. I mean, it's the individual even. It gets
Right.
right down to, to that level. It's almost like, if you will, Peter is eating with Gentiles, and then or and then Paul, and he jumps up like, no, I wasn't there. I didn't do that. It's like, and I think Christians are really divided over this. I think if I don't know anybody from that community, I can be very strong on, oh no, this is wrong, and da 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 da, And then if I do know somebody, maybe a very close friend or maybe a relative, all of a sudden my view changes. Well, with this individual, I'm okay with them. And then we kind of like, but if somebody else comes in that doesn't know them and knows I'm a Christian, I'm going to jump up and act like I wasn't fellowshipping with, and we've got all this kind of weird stuff going on, trying, as Loren said, trying to cherry pick 2 or 3 scriptures and say, see, the Bible says, and Paul says, and therefore I'm on safe ground to be this way. I said a lot there to come down to, I think we're in an extremely interesting time that history is going to look back on, and hopefully we do it right this time.
Well, as long as Protestant Gnosticism is around, we won't.
Fair enough.
I don't know if I don't. I don't know. I mean, the Catholic tradition has survived, right? I don't know about There's a lot of splits in the Catholic Church
Sure.
that aren't known to Protestants, and some are very, very, very ugly. They're kind of almost Westboro Baptist type ugly.
Mm.
Huh.
And I don't, how can the Catholic Church pull us out of this darkness? I kind of don't think so. I don't think so. Orthodoxy to me is an utter. I'd rather get in Noah's Ark and float across the ocean than get into Orthodoxy and float across the ocean. It's more barnacle encrusted and the wood is rotten and oh Lord have mercy,
And yet there
Uh,
seems to be a considerable amount of uh, evangelicals uh, who are returning to orthodoxy.
well, but what they're returning to is not orthodoxy. They're returning to the fantasy of the early church that did really good Trinitarian theology.
Okay.
That's what they're returning to,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
That's what they really want. They could get the same thing if they read 20th century thinkers like Karl Barth, Catherine Lacuna, Jürgen Moltmann,
Hmm.
Veli-Matti Kärkkäinen. They could get the same thing, but they don't know the moderns. And so they think if they're going back and reading their precious Athanasius, that and don't laugh. I have an icon of Athanasius right here on my wall from Greece, a blessed icon, and I love Athanasius, but yeah, but they're confusing the kind of the myth in their head of this pure theology that's has a different anthropological base. I think that's why they go there. It is the anthropology is different. It's not Augustinian,
Hmm.
so it's more in terms of grace perfecting nature, divinization, the God within and all that stuff.
Well, I find that also interesting that there seems to be a move on the part of well, a large contingency. Let's put it that way, to attempt to get back to the way the early church did things, and yet there is at the same time a denial of the writings of the early church fathers.
That's true.
I'm confused. Am I hearing this correctly? Are you saying, okay, say that again, because they want to go back to the early church, but they want to ignore the writings of the fathers?
Yes, yes. In other words,
Really?
they want to flatline read New Testament
Okay.
and
Yeah,
okay, we're getting back to the way they did it in the early church. It's like so we're going back to house church, and we're going back to communion, and we're going back to the Apostles' Creed doctrine, and
right.
those things. And then you say, okay, but the early church fathers, this is what they wrote about. This is the things they talked about. And they're like, "Oh no, we don't. Oh no, 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 no. We don't. No, we don't go there. We don't go into like you know what all these guys wrote. We go into what the Bible says is the way they did it." And it's like I look at it and say, uh, "But how do you understand what they did and why they did it without talking or listening, let me rephrase that, to what the ones who did it explain on why they did things.
Yeah.
What
That's
was
a
their
really
points
good
of
point, Jim.
contention? What was their points of arguing? What was their points of unity? What brought them together?
Right.
But to just do house church, I've read tons of books by people who are trying to do house church or this or that, and this is the way you do house church, and I'm like, all we're doing is we're scrambling the eggs left to right instead of right to left. It's like, and when we get it all done, we still have a plate of scrambled eggs. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like we still have a leader, we still have a worship set, we still have a doctrine of this house church, and whatever. And
Right.
it's like, yeah.
I
So,
guess in some places, smaller is better.
well, okay, we won't go there. Well,
Well, here's the deal. Do you remember back 1980ish? There was an attempt. I think it was in Southern California to bring the dying Jesus movement back to the liturgical stuff with Jack Sparks,
yeah, sure.
right? And I thought Sparks was on the right track at the time, you know. And I've always kind of thought that if the church is ever going to get back, it's going to have to be through its liturgy. Unfortunately, and very, very sadly, the church's most important theology book is their hymnal or their praise chorus book or whatever. And that's most people's theology, and it's very bad. But it's what they know and what they can sing, you know. So with my hope is that as we move away from sacrificial Christianity over the next decade or two, and as non-sacrificial Christian ideas begin to become much more generative and of new sociological structures that we would call church, okay, as the gospel becomes generative of all that, we will see. I hope that again in the liturgy, there's something that has to happen when the community gets together and says the name of Jesus together. Okay. And at bottom, at minimum, it needs to be the breaking of bread and the sharing of a cup at minimum, you know. Bam. So, in that sense, the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, the more liturgical Protestant traditions, they're correct. The Eucharist has that key role, but we also talked a few weeks back about where the real power of the Eucharist is, and it's not in this sanitized, individualistic nonsense that we're doing today for people, a little theater,
Sure.
Yeah, that's why I find this whole conversation really fascinating, because it's not just some stale historical thing that was back then and here's what the early church was dealing with and stuff. It comes just as Jim brought it into today. It has direct implications on things that we're wrestling with right now. As we talked about back then, it was the Jew-Gentile split. Today, there's the LGBTQ division. And for me, Jim, when you shared about that, see, that really hits home for my family, because it's not, for us, it's not this theory that we're going through. Michaela, as we've talked about before, my daughter, she's an evangelist. She
Right.
has friends of all kinds of people, and they love Jesus. And we have had many conversations as of late of genuine concern about family members she can't introduce her friends to, because they are viewed as being, some family members even said, if you even are friends with a gay person, then you're on the wrong track.
Sure.
And so it's like, it's a very real world thing in my family. This isn't just like theory or, having lofty discussions or things like that. This is real. And then, it's funny when you were talking about the early church, I never connected those dots. You're right about, we want to get back to the early church. We want to get back to the early church. And then you bring up something like, well, the early church had 3 views of hell and they were all considered orthodox. No, there was, it's like, well, you said you want to get back to the early church. That means you got to open up to accepting some different views of hell there.
Well,
we won't go into that one today.
Well, that's why we needed to have a canon and sprinkle some holy water on it and make it the Holy Bible, because we could do away with all those early writings that were apostate.
Right. Yeah. So
He said rather tongue in cheek.
right. So, but that's why I find it interesting when I identify with the struggle going on in the early church that we were just talking about with Paul and his passion that he's writing with. Because it relates to things that just it's like same struggle, just different time, different topic. It's like, has that not always been the case? It's like, it goes back to what the past conversations we've had on here about law. Isn't the problem in the church we're always looking for who's out?
Or we have to mimetically scapegoat and create an out in order to be a community, which the gospel says is exactly what we're not to do. The cross is all about being reconciled around the one that is a failed scapegoat, Jesus. But let's do this as a thought experiment. I don't know if we've done this on this podcast before. So already within 2 decades of the death of Jesus, the church is fragmented, big lines drawn down the right lines in the sand. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we know that the Johannine community is also anti-Petrine. Okay. And they're located by tradition in the Ephesus area. I find it interesting that after Paul goes to Ephesus, he not only seems to have more courage about his own apostleship in the Corinthian letters, but in 2 Corinthians in particular, particularly chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6, he's using Johannine themes. And I think when Paul realized, hey, I'm not the only outsider. There's this community that was also not part of the Jerusalem church that got expelled or something. And that gave him a little chutzpah. And so I want to throw that into the mix.
That's really cool. I mean, because it just brings up that thing too of how we so need. We talked last week about Jesus going through his death and all by himself, and how as humans we so need that support. Many times just that person who goes. What we're doing on this podcast actually is you're not crazy. And I love that Paul's out there kind of like, am I just out here all by myself? And then gets in touch with these different communities. And then, like you said, you see a new boldness in him that it's like, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy.
That's right.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I think, it's a lot of fun to do this kind of thinking in and around Paul's life. I'm very grateful for Pauline scholarship. The last 100 years of Pauline scholarship has been really remarkable. I mean, really remarkable. It's in fact, I'll say this: the last 100 years in New Testament studies has been nothing short of revelatory. And the problem is that you have to do so much work in all these documents, and you have to, like, for example, when was Luke written? When was John written? When was Romans written? Well, how do you know? How would you even begin to know? Well, it says in the front of my Bible, Romans was written in 54. Well, where do you get that from?
He signed it at the top, when he turned it in, he put the date.
So, for example, just creating a chronology of Paul's life requires some very, very nitty gritty work just to create a chronology, and then to have a chronology of the early church that you can build around that. That's hard work. That's a lot of documents, and not just New Testament, but the early apostolic fathers, the 2nd century fathers, the 2nd century Gnostic sects, 2nd century Jewish Christian literature. There's a lot in there. And if the big macro picture, I don't think most New Testament scholars ever get to, anymore. They don't anymore. They used to, but they don't anymore.
So understanding that, Michael, for our listeners, if somebody wanted to kind of pull their knowledge up a notch or two, You said the last 100 years of Pauline studies is phenomenal. Is there someone that they could go to? Is there an author or a series of books or that you would recommend for the average reader?
So if you're an average reader, I'm assuming that words that have more than 3 syllables won't bother you too much. I'm teasing. For the average reader, I would go pick up Douglas Campbell's Pauline Dogmatics.
Excellent.
Now, that book, for me, is going to be a benchmark for the next 30, 40, 50 years in Pauline studies, because Pauline scholarship really has not engaged that book that much yet. But to me, it's Paul's gospel writ large. Campbell, for my money, Campbell is the only person, apart from Marcion, to understand Paul, and even Marcion misunderstood him. But I think that Doug Campbell has set Paul free in his work.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think
awesome.
sometimes we get on subjects and we put a lot of information out there, but then we don't really always follow through with the resources on where a person can begin their own research. So,
right.
That's
the nice
thing
about Pauline Dogmatics by Campbell is that he's engaging with the evangelical tradition in that book.
Okay. Excellent.
He's a very well-read thinker in Karl Barth. He very orthodox. I mean, beautifully orthodox, and an incredible. What a mind! I mean, geez,
Excellent.
Wow, very cool. All right, you guys. Well, we're at time for this week. We're going to pick it up next week, looking at Paul's evolving theology. That'll be fun. So until then, Jim, where can people get a hold of your book?
On Amazon.
All right, and it's a worthy read, everybody. And Michael, where can people find your stuff?
Same, and YouTube.
All right, cool. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you all next week.